Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all at the American University of Beirut. We are glad to have you all in this panel discussion on the Nexus approach, the road to water, energy, and food security in the Arab world. This panel discussion is organized by the Climate Change and Environment in the Arab World program at the Islam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at AUB. As the title implies, our discussion today aims to develop a better understanding of why we need a Nexus approach to a policy making in the region and how the Water-Energy-Food Nexus approach can help in sustainably securing food, water, and energy for the Arab world in the face of a growing population, a growing economy, and increasing urbanization rate. This, which will impose further stress by a changing climate. We will have 4 presentations today, each of 20 minutes, followed by an open discussion. I will now introduce our panelists. Our first panelist today is Mr. Holger Hoff. Mr. Hoff is a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute in Sweden and at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany. Mr. Hoff's main research interests are in global and regional water, food, and environmental security under global and climate change. He is a consultant on German and Swedish development cooperation on climate adaptation and integrated natural resource management. Mr. Hoff has been the director of the Global Water Systems Project of the Earth System Science Partnership, senior scientist in the Dialogue on Water and Climate, the Netherlands, and research analyst on climate, water, and ecosystem for the German Advisory Council on Global Change. He is also the author of Understanding the Nexus, the background paper for the Bonn 2011 conference on that topic. Mr. Hoff will be actually introducing exactly that. He will be talking about introducing the Nexus in the MENA region. Our second panelist today is Professor Rabi Mohtar, who is an AUB alumnus himself and who will be joining us on Skype from Texas. He is the Texas Engineering Experiment Station Endowed Professor at Texas A&M University, College Station, US. He is the founding director of Qatar Environment and Energy Research Institute, a member of Qatar Foundation, Research and Development, and the founding director of Strategic Projects at Qatar Foundation Research and Development. He was also the inaugural director of the Global Engineering Programs at Purdue University, Indiana. Professor Mohtar focused on conserving natural resources that face global challenges, such as increasing food and water supplies for a growing population. He will be giving us a regional perspective by talking about the Water-Energy-Food Nexus approach to resource allocation in the Arab world. Our third panelist today is Mr. Ralf, Dr. Ralf Klingbeil, representing UN-ESQA. Dr. Klingbeil is the Regional Advisor Environment and Water at the Sustainable Development and Productivity Division at UN-ESQA. He joined UN-ESQA in 2009, where he contributes to the services and support that UN-ESQA provides to its 17 member states, primarily in the fields of environment and water. Prior to his appointment at UN-ESQA, Dr. Klingbeil served as Senior Program Officer at the UN Water Decade Program on Capacity Development and as Project Coordinator in International Cooperation for the German Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources, Germany. Dr. Klingbeil will be presenting on food security, water security, improved food value chains for a more sustainable socio-economic development. Our final panelist is our very own Dr. Nadim Farajalla, the Faculty Research Director of the Climate Change and Environment in the Arab World Program at IFI. Dr. Farajalla is an Associate Professor of Environmental Hydrology at the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences at AUB. He received his PhD in Environmental Engineering from the University of Oklahoma in the US. He served as a senior scientist at Stone Environmental in the USA and as a senior environmental engineer on major environmental and infrastructure projects in Lebanon, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Angola, and Nigeria with Dar al-Handasa. His proficiency areas include climate change impact and adaptation, water resources management, and specifically sustainable water management practices. Dr. Farajalla will be presenting an analysis of water, energy, food institutions in the Lebanese government and the relevant strategies of each. Before we start, I would kindly like to ask you to please put your phone on silent, and we will now start with Holger.
Yes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. With great pleasure that I'm addressing you here on this so-called Nexus today. Understanding the Nexus, as I was asked to explain, and I might say that many people understand many different things by the Nexus, and I would not want to impose any very strict definition on you here. I will try to convey to you some of the principles and some of the initial activities that we are undertaking under this title. It all started, as Rana was saying, with the Bonn, well, it took off, I should say, with this Bonn Nexus conference in 2011, where we provided the background paper, and I was surprised myself about the career that this expression took afterwards, with so many conferences and papers and contributions, which I never expected beforehand. And I'm not blaming anyone if a certain level of Nexus fatigue appears in the discussions nowadays. But I hope I can show to you what we mean by it, and that we believe there is a lot of benefit from applying the principles behind that approach. And I'm very glad to do it specifically for the MENA region, which I wasn't really asked for to do, but it seems to be suitable on this occasion, because I do believe that the region is in need of such an approach, and it's also in the position to provide some guidance to other regions that would obviously also be well advised to follow similar lines of thinking. Rana already explained that the Nexus approach is in need because of the ongoing trends. I'm mostly speaking about the natural resource side of it. There are many other facets to a Nexus approach. In terms of natural resources, we call it a resource squeeze of the various natural resources that originates on the one hand from increasing demand, leading to an overexploitation of these resources, sometimes degradation, water salinization, land degradation, erosion, and aggravated by climate change. And I do believe that there is hardly any other region in the world that is likely for more severe resource squeeze also due to climate change than the MENA region is. So I would argue that business as usual, simply extrapolating current trends, is not an option, but instead there is a strong need for innovations, innovative thinking and approaches to increase resource use efficiencies across all resources. And as I will try to explain later on, that there are many good attempts to increase resource use efficiency, but if you only do it on one resource, there's a big risk that you have negative effects on other resources. And at the same time, you can then, if you do it well, reduce environmental pressures and also support economic development towards what's these days called green economy. I'm happy to discuss any of the things I'm stating here further. If you wish, please ask. I will go through them rather briefly in this presentation, but they all, to my mind, deserve further closer look. The general principles of a Nexus approach are relatively simple, and most people would agree to them. The trick is really the implementation later on, but it's about generating synergies by looking across sectors or looking across resources. And what I just said, otherwise you risk to cause negative externalities if you optimize only very mono-sectoral. And there will always be remaining trade-offs that need to be negotiated. And that's also a task of Nexus activities, of research activities in particular, to quantify these. So to put them on the table so that decision makers, policy makers, stakeholders have a better grasp on them and can negotiate them. Eventually, the whole idea is to strengthen resilience. Again, I'm happy to explain what that means. Starting, for example, from climate adaptation. You want to do robust adaptation, meaning not only focusing on one sector, one resource, or one pressure only, but try to be broad enough to, in the end, have a resilient system, natural, social, socioeconomic, that survives, withstands shocks. Well, what's new? Many people ask this question these days, and I'm ready to say it's not all new. There have been many integrated approaches, which is what a Nexus approach is before, such as IWRM that most of you would be aware of, or integrated coastal zone management, landscapes approaches, as the World Bank is promoting them, ecosystem-based approaches like those under the Convention on Biological Diversity, and also multifunctional systems go here, where you try to achieve various different outputs at the same time. I come back to these things in red further. What may be new is that, different from, say, IWRM, a nexus approach does not start from one sector or one resource and then invite the others slowly or stepwise in, but it tries to provide a level playing field from a start, also leveling out some potential inequities, power imbalances, to really invite all the sectors to discuss at equal level. Just as schematics, always nice to have a picture, the different resources. And don't be surprised, I put here water, I put here energy, but then I put land because I'm taking a resource perspective. You may take different perspectives, institutional, economic. The point always being you want to focus on the interlinkages, not so much on the corner of the triangle or whatever figure you have there, to strengthen them. You have your experts on energy, they do very good jobs and they should keep doing that. You don't want to lose that expertise and that responsibility, but you want to emphasize the linkages, again, to avoid these negative externalities. And indeed, it's about water, energy, and food security in the first place. So there, food comes back, just so you don't get too worried. Reducing negative externalities, such as if you don't look at the arrows, the red arrows, you may cause, through bad land management, you may increase pollution of waters, or flooding may be an effect of bad land management, and vice versa. Erosion or biodiversity loss may be an effect of bad water management, or strong dependency on energy, fossil fuel imports, or high CO2 emissions can be a result of water management that's not energy smart, but that's very energy intensive for pumping, for desalination, and so on. But on the other hand, if you're aware, you can generate co-benefits, such as more carbon storage in your land, if you manage land and water together. Bioenergy plantations, if done well, if climate smart, if they can be climate smart, they can be water smart, but it's a matter of planning, of spatial planning, for example, of spatial configuration of your landscape. Water storage, I come back to that one, may be an issue that has to do with land management, which is soil water storage in particular, and so on. And again, it's all about building resilience, I would argue. I come back to the storage issue once more in a little while. Building blocks, as we use them in our initial nexus, we call them case studies. I wouldn't claim that we have done the full cycle yet, but we start, being scientists ourselves, we start from what we call baseline assessments, understand the situation across the resources, data harmonization, compilation, and providing a sharing platform for these data. Then we try to point towards the future, explore different scenarios across the resources, the business as usual scenario versus a nexus scenario potentially, and we have tools for that. And economic cost-benefit analysis are important. Nexus approaches don't come without costs, so-called transaction costs, because all of a sudden you have to deal with other sectors that were of no matter to you beforehand. And you may also design on the positive side economic incentives to other sectors. RED mechanisms may be an incentive coming from the carbon sector, from the climate sector, but they may have other co-benefits on vegetation, on biodiversity, if done in a nexus manner. Payments for environmental services, similarly. And obviously, to do this, you need nexus platforms. We have started establishing these across various sectors where these interactions, negotiations take place, and eventually, hopefully, better decisions. Strengthening of bridging institutions. There's a lot to be said about why we don't have nexus approaches yet, what the institutional conditions would be. Bridging institutions are such institutions that, per definition, per mandate, deal with various sectors or resources. River basin authorities are an example that we are working with. Sometimes they're interministerial committees. There can be other forms. It doesn't always need to invent new superstructures. It's more a matter of finding mechanisms or institutions that strengthen the dialogue, the exchange, and the understanding. And eventually, and that's something we haven't really achieved, I admit, easily, making a case for implementation through all these steps. Nexus tools. At our institute, the Stockholm Environment Institute, we have developed Nexus tools, which originally were not meant for that purpose, but they serve as well. demonstrating quantitatively, spatially explicit win-win opportunities, or the benefits to be generated, and also the trade-offs. We are doing it quite extensively in the Upper Blue Nile and the Lake Tana region there. I will not go into any details. I just want to give you the picture. We look at outcomes such as food production, such as energy generation, biofuels and electricity, such as the level of the lake, which is very important for the livelihoods of the people there, the fishermen and so on, and discharge reduction downstream of the lake, which is important for aquatic ecosystems. And then we run various scenarios. One has to do with transfers, one has to do with irrigation, one has to do with soil and water conservation. And obviously, it's not always positive outcomes of one scenario. So you start quantifying what your consequences of certain interventions and certain policies are, and then put that on the table for negotiations to make it much more transparent what you're dealing with if you take a certain decision. The tools we have are, one is a long-established tool on energy called LEAP, and one is a planning tool, a scenario tool on water called WEEP, and they have been used in many contexts. And as I understand, they have been used in Lebanon's national communications, and I was told also in the national water sector strategy here in Lebanon, that I'm not sure of, I must say. How to apply the Nexus concept, first of all. There are many ways of putting this into practice. I would argue that soil and water conservation and conservation agriculture is one way of doing so, where you can, for example, improve your productivity of the water in the soil. We also call it green water, and that way reduce the demand for irrigation. But you have co-benefits in terms of climate mitigation, adaptation, and increasing resilience if you're doing it well. Similarly, climate-safe and water-smart land use and also urban planning can have co-benefits on other sectors, accounting, for example, for changes in precipitation, sea level rise when doing your planning. Adding energy to the equation. In agriculture, I believe there is a need for improving your energy efficiency. Otherwise, in many regions of the world, you will run out of energy if you increase your demand for pumping, for fertilizer, for machinery in a non-sustainable way. The old green revolution may no longer work under the new resource squeeze conditions. Moving towards renewable energy, but that may have implications on land, may have implications on water. Think them together. And an example would also be energy recovery from wastewater treatment, where there's a lot of potential to bridge across the various sectors. We, with partners here in the region, we have initiated, it's not myself, I must say, it's German Development Corporation, a case study in Jordan, which is something related to the highlands overdrawing of aquifers, trying to reduce that. There is a pilot on solar energy farming in the Azraq Basin, which is meant as an alternative to the conventional farming, providing income. You will not succeed with your ideas unless you can provide alternative incomes and livelihoods to the people. If working well, and it's just starting, I must say, it could reduce water demand and energy demand at the same time, and increase, also contribute to climate mitigation, at least in a small way, possibly increase drought resilience, or doing something on adaptation also. It's a highly participatory process, obviously important, with a so-called Highland Water Forum there. There are other case studies, but when I'm asked, well, where is the Nexus working well, I wouldn't say it is, and it's never really doing so under the title Nexus. It's a matter of looking at successful integrated approaches and pulling that knowledge together to learn from it and to upscale eventually. I already said that I would like to draw your attention for a moment to the issue of storage, whether it's water, energy, or food. But as you will notice, I will not conclude on it. I just would like to trigger your thinking as to what's there in terms of interlinkages between the sectors of between the three resources and storing them better, which is all about bridging spatio-temporal variability. Like if you have on the water side, if you have seasonal precipitation, quick runoff, you may need storage. If you have, for your energy side, if you have variability in your renewable energy resources, you need that storage. Or in general speaking, if you have population concentrations, such as if they're all living along the coast or if they're all living in cities, you need some storage because your resources would not be matching your population distribution. A quick word on water storage, first of all. There are many storage options. There's actually a wide spectrum. You can store it above ground, you can store it below ground, you can store some of it in the soils or in artificial reservoirs or ponds or tanks. There are many options, the whole spectrum. So don't think narrow when you think of water storage. And they align with land management. They align with energy management. If you're able to store more water in your soils through good land management, as I said before, you reduce your irrigation demand, you may increase your land productivity, your food productivity. In terms of reservoirs, as you would know, there's a lot of potential for multi-use systems that produce hydropower and irrigation if they're planned for both outputs at the same time. If you have hill water storage, you enable gravity-fed water delivery that may save on pumping and on energy eventually. I was thinking maybe groundwater storage can also have co-benefits in terms of reducing seawater intrusion and that way improve your productivity of the land. There are probably many of these examples that are not always completely thought through when thinking of water storage. I'm trying to say that it's worthwhile to open your mind and to think about co-benefits and potential negative externalities if you do this planning. Yeah, my point here, that's almost the last one, is that I would argue in a MENA context, Lebanon, resource-wise, is still in a very good position, almost in a luxury position. Water-wise, for example, as you would know better than me, there's no other country that has as much rainfall and as much per capita water availability. But that holds also for land, that holds for forest cover, for many of... welcome to disagree. I'm just taking a few statistics here, and I'm happy to learn differently. But many indicators show that Lebanon is not as resource-squeezed as some of the other MENA countries are. And that seems to expand. I'm quoting from literature here, not from my own work. That seems to also hold for some of the economic indicators, where you have, for example, here, economic water productivity in agriculture in dollars per cubic meter or cubic kilometer, that is. That holds for poverty indicators and so on. What I'm trying to say is keep that position. Don't risk it. As we see everywhere in the world, there's a tendency towards delaying action until the situation becomes urgent, and then go to reactive measures, to emergency measures that usually tend to be much more expensive. I've had a similar discussion with colleagues in India, where this is a situation which lends itself to testing new approaches, such as the Nexus approach, because there's a little more leeway than if the pressure is so intense that you have no maneuvering space anymore. But I wouldn't use it as a reason for delaying action. That's what I'm trying to say. And that's my last slide. A few more general principles. I don't want to conclude because this work hasn't been concluded yet. Start from win-wins. If you want to work with people in the different sectors and burden them with this additional concept and task, you need to show the win-wins, what's in there for them. And the win-wins are a good thing because you don't need additional investment, first of all. And I take the example again of wastewater treatment, which I understand is not that widespread in the country here yet. The potential for energy recovery clearly is a win-win. You can save on all fronts. Search for innovations. This example I gave you on solar farming or potentially solar desalination may be a good one, although yet to be seen if it's economically feasible. We discussed before coming to the podium here that knowledge sharing within the region is certainly a mechanism that has to be applied to this Nexus concept as well. Some of the MENA countries, especially the Gulf countries, are pushing ahead on desalination and also on solar desalination these days. If that's upscaled, economies of scale may set in, and there may be benefits to be derived for other countries. Strengthening diversity from our resilience view is very recommendable. If you have higher diversity, you strengthen your resilience. Sorry, I meant to say strengthen resilience through diversity. That was a bit rushed here. And storage is one of these examples that I showed you. If you think more broadly, if you apply the different storage opportunities across the country in the specific contexts, you diversify and you're better prepared for sudden shocks, let's say. If you put all your eggs into one basket, and I just read about this example in your neighboring country where they put many eggs currently in a basket that's called Red Sea, Dead Sea Canal, that may be too narrow for sustaining in uncertain futures. Build on existing initiatives. Don't invent something completely new, but take off from something that's ongoing, where people are looking for added benefits if they take on board such a Nexus approach. We discussed over the past few days with Lebanese colleagues the strategic environmental assessments initiated here in Lebanon on the water strategy and on renewable energy. They are meant to be quite broadly encompassing. So that may be quite a nice vehicle, rather than inventing something completely new. Strengthen these kind of processes by this Nexus concept and the data that underlay them. use the tools that I presented or others. I said already, coordinating across sectors is very important. Bridging institutions may be one way of doing so, and I learned yesterday that, for example, we discussed climate change a lot, as you can tell. There's a climate change coordination unit in the Ministry of Environment, which has focal points in various other ministries and sectors. That's the kind of bridging institution I'm looking for, not inventing something completely new that would take full responsibility, but that fosters coordination and communication. Add value to opportunities if they're upcoming. That's mainstreaming, really. And that would also be Nexus mainstreaming. If there is a new water strategy under development, if there is a new energy hydropower planning or renewable energy planning underway, bring some experts from the other sectors in and use these opportunities when something has to be developed anyways to integrate this new thinking. Well, it's not so new, as I said, but it's certainly not coming through much. And integrate science with decision-making. There are various good institutions, national and international institutions, that have so much knowledge that's underutilized, which needs more communication, which needs more translation of that knowledge and that data. That's all I wanted to say, and I'd be happy about a discussion on these issues if possible.
We will now have our second speaker, Professor Rabi Mohtar. He's with us on Skype from Texas.
Good morning, everyone. It's quite early in College Station, Texas, and I'm really pleased to be joining you. I apologize for maybe being a little bit not quite up ready, but I would like to start by thanking the organizers for giving me the opportunity to be there with you. I really wish that I was there physically among you, but the distance has prevented me from being there. Thank you very much, especially to Dr. Nadim Farajalla for giving me that opportunity to speak to you. I would like to start by giving maybe, next slide please. I would start by highlighting one statement that Dr. Hoff have mentioned, which is when people ask, give us some successful examples of the Nexus, really he highlighted some very important aspect of the Nexus, which is the integrative thinking. Yes, there are many tools around, and I will share with you one of those tools that we have been working with, but it's really about transformational thinking. It's about integrative thinking. It's about considering the whole when you're deciding on the pieces, and that's what really the Nexus is a paradigm shift in a decision-making process where you really look at the holistic view of the system as you make decisions about the individual pieces. We all know that the food, water, energy as major resources are constrained, and more so in our region, in the MENA region, than any other place. And as such, decision-making process for food security, water security, and energy security need to be looked at as an integrated platform where all of the elements are taken into consideration, let alone the climate change, the economic pressure, the societal pressure, and other pressure that we see, the time for which the Nexus integrative thinking is really upon us for us to move forward for better resource management and resource allocation. I will stop into a few moments, into a few benchmarks in the history of the Nexus. A few years ago, it was an intellectual exercise that few of us were engaged in, and it really has got momentum right after the Bonn conference in 2011. There are a few other kind of major benchmark in that trajectory that led to a transformational thinking in terms of the policymakers, in terms of the platform, from being an intellectual exercise into becoming a major thrust in the research, policy, as well as the private sector arena. I would quote in after the Bonn conference in 2011, some major events at the World Economic Forum in 2011 with the publication of the water security and the highlight in the Rio 20 plus also a couple of years ago, and the highlight at the climate change UNFCCC COP18, where both the presidents of COP18 as well as the General Secretary of the UN highlighting the importance of the Nexus as a way to go forward for mitigating climate change. The last stop I would make, which is very recent, at the end of November, there was a follow-up meeting in Berlin for the Nexus, and there was a gathering of major players in the Nexus highlighting the importance of moving forward from a concept into an implementation tool. This week, the last stop I'd like to mention is that this week at the International Water Summit in Abu Dhabi, the World Bank is launching its Nexus platform, which is really, I anticipate this will give the Nexus community and the Nexus thinking another ammunition of moving forward. This transformational thinking has been reflected in all of the major conferences that you see around, which really led us to think, okay, we got the concept, how do we really get about moving it from a concept of integrative thinking into some tools and some ways in which we apply these concepts. Next. Before I go further into the Nexus, I'd like to highlight the importance of acting now in terms of the global picture of the water, energy, and food. You see on the graph is a highlight, the centerpiece of that Nexus, in my opinion, is the water resources, which is constrained in many parts of the region. And Lebanon, yes, at the moment we get by with water management, with better water management. However, the picture is still looking very gloomy for the rest of the region. We're looking at adding 40% new water in the next 20 to 30 years, according to many projections. That water is going to go to split into agriculture, industry, and domestic application. So 40% new water that need to be found somehow, or had to be collected from unused water resources. And I also stopped at a major highlight that Ralf's presentation mentioned, which is the green water, that I believe is going to be the only way we can bridge the agricultural water gap, which is the food water gap in the next in the few years to come. So we've got 40% additional water that we need globally, and a lot of it, in fact, in the region. If you partition this in the MENA region, the picture looks even gloomier. This slide shows global trend. However, the picture in the Middle East is gloomier, where more than 72% of the water, fresh water, is used for agriculture. In the MENA region, our water use efficiency is way less. And in some countries in the MENA region, that agricultural water consumes over 80 to 85% of the fresh water supply. The picture is not looking any better when it comes to the energy. We have an increase in energy demand by at least 40% in 2030. The challenge there is not only coming up with new energy, the challenge is coming up with additional infrastructure that allow us to supply additional demand for that energy. And by many counts, the least projection for food demand would be increased by 50% by 2030. Some statistics go as high as doubling the current food demand that we have. On top of that, we are receiving, and we are projected to receive 10 to 30% less precipitation in 2030 by the projections given by the IPCC, which actually by the recent report that was released by the IPCC confirm these figures. So if you put all of these as a package, we are going into a head-on crash unless something radically change in the way we manage water, energy, food in an integrated bundle. So let me define from my standpoint, what is the problem statement? We keep hammering the issue that we need integrated thinking in our decision making, and we need to really look at the whole package. But yet, I do believe the science community has a challenge, which is we have not delivered a quantitative and an interconnected, and we have not deployed an integrated strategy for a holistic management tool to these policymakers. So unless those are easy to use tools that integrate the whole resource management portfolio, we cannot expect that the decision makers would be able to develop a holistic integrative management strategy for the water, energy, and food. As such, we are heading towards threatening a socioeconomic stability and the resilience of these global resources. Two elements I'd like to stop by before I introduce one of these tools that could be used for a holistic water resources management. The first one is an integrative view of all of the stakeholders based on inclusiveness and based on multi-scale. So one frequent question I ask the audience when we're talking about, for example, water management, where are the farmers in the group? And very rarely you find farmers among the audience that we talk. So we end up hydrologists and water scientists dealing with water management among scientists within that community without overreaching out to other stakeholders that do affect the nexus. So inclusiveness in the discussion is a very important, and multi-scale. By multi-scale, I mean governance at all scales of the governance, and as well as public, private, and civil society. So all of these elements of the decision-making process and integrated processes need to be represented on the table for a nexus transformational thinking to be prevailing. The second point I'd like to stop is the role of the private sector. And this is very important in the region, in the MENA region, more so than any other region of the world because of the lack of engagement in the private sector and their responsibility towards both. One, responsible investment. Second is the technology development. I'll give some examples here to highlight the point. The examples I'd like to give is in the Gulf region, where I've spent the last 4 or 5 years of my career. When we are looking at, in fact, a few years ago, we were looking at Qatar, and in fact, the whole GCC, we were looking at solar energy technology, and most of the industry that has been deployed for that region has not considered the uniqueness of the region. So we are looking at a clean energy at the expense of high water footprint for some of the solar technology that has been deployed. This is the technology that requires a lot of water for cooling. It's a technology that may not be suitable because of dust accumulation and dust effect on the solar efficiency. My point here is that responsible investment and technology deployment need to be a shared responsibility between the governance and decision makers as well as the industry. So industry and private sector need to play a major role in this transformational thinking and the implementation of the nexus. I'd like to present a web-based tool that we've been working with for the last few years and go over a few of the highlights of that, which really is a simple web-based platform that integrates major elements of science, policy, as well as user input. So a user would define a scenario. So it is a scenario-based platform. A user would define a scenario, whether that is a water-centric, energy-centric, or food-centric. Those are different scenarios. They would put in what we call the, they would define their scenario. They would put in the basket. It could be the water basket, it could be the energy basket, or the food basket, which defines all of the input, the relationship database into the scenario. And there are a science input, which is all of these relationships that integrates water, energy, and food. And also, more importantly, there's a policy input. At the end of the day, a policymaker needs to be comfortable in making a decision based on constraints that are outside and beyond the science. I'll give some examples here. As part of the output to this tool, there are series of what I call sustainability elements, and those are integrated into a sustainability index. The elements of the sustainability index would include environmental cost, would include ecological cost, would include carbon emission, it includes cost, it includes water footprint for an energy technology, it includes energy footprint for a water technology, and also it includes implications on the food. All of these are combined into sustainability index that will rate a certain technology or a certain decision against other. The policy input is very critical there, because as a policymaker, he or she has to define what is most important in their mind before a technology is being chosen or a scenario being chosen. So for a policymaker, cost might be very important. So the scenarios will be ranked or based on cost, while for other policymaker, environmental impact could be more important. So a policy will have to weigh these elements of the sustainability index according to their own constraint. And that's why I think the policy input is very, very important in this regard. So we have been working with this policy tool that integrates all of these elements using a relationship and database specific to that location in which the scenarios are being constructed for. And we have had some successes. I'll show you one example of the scenario that we conducted specifically in Qatar around the food security area. Next, please. So you're looking here at one scenario for one scenario that you look at a certain base, which is the base scenario that we looked here is 10% production, which is the current level of production for food product within the state of Qatar. And we wanted to look at to what extent the government, the state of Qatar, can go as far as domestic production. As you know, the state of Qatar at the moment imports 90% of its food. Some of this is a foreign investment, the other is state import from various sources. And there has been a national push to go into higher level of local production. And the earlier plan called for 100% domestic production, at least to push that envelope. And here is some of the analysis that we were able to construct using the Nexus tool that highlight what are the bottlenecks. And to many of our surprises, the bottleneck were not cost, because cost was already high when it comes to import and foreign production. So we were looking at water. I'm not going to go there about the subsidy, but water wasn't the bottleneck, even though if you look at different cost equations for the energy cost and the production of water, water might rise. In fact, water will rise to be a bottleneck. But within the constraint that we conducted the analysis, water was not the bottleneck for moving beyond the 10%, nor the other emission factors, even though carbon emission is already high in Qatar. But the first bottleneck that the government need to worry about, according to this analysis, was land. So we needed, for a 50% additional increase in food production, we would need an almost 800% additional land that need to be secured, which is not an easy task, knowing that there might be plenty of land resources. However, the arable land is very, very limited in Qatar, and many of these available land are not suitable because of the high salinity that exists, and a major high level scale of land reclamation is needed. Next. So you're looking here at a continuous analysis of what of that same scenario, looking at again that the land being the most the highly contested bottleneck in the food security program to move forward. Now, what this analysis is able to do for the policymakers, they will be able to look at such results and say, to what extent would be feasible for me to secure additional arable land, or to what extent would be feasible for me to secure additional water, or to what extent I can live with the environmental consequences. And I think that's what the decision maker would be able to see, and that what would inform their decision on this case study, which is a food security, knowing that it will have a high water footprint, but it's a calculated water footprint, a high energy footprint, a high carbon footprint, and a high land footprint, but at least those would be calculated and the decision would be informed. What is next that we are working on at the moment? As I mentioned, we are working on a Water Nexus tool, and this is the portal. Please feel free to visit. There's a beta version that is available. What we're working on at the moment is regionalizing that effort, and I'm hoping that, in fact, the launch of this project is expected to be next month in Jordan, and we're hoping that Lebanon would be on board, even though they're not on the original list of participants. The project host would be in Qatar. I'll be running it here technically from Texas. Participants include Jordan as well as Tunis, and we're hoping that additional members such as Lebanon and Palestine would be added to the list of participants. Let me highlight two specific cases that we'll be looking at specifically in this Nexus tool portfolio. In addition to the project that I just mentioned, we're also working with the International Renewable Energy Agency to look at, next please, to look at the role of renewable energy in the Nexus. So here's a slide that summarizes the first project, which is the Water-Energy-Food Nexus, an application to strategic planning for natural resources sustainability. However, the focus for this project will be food security, and as I mentioned, we're looking at 3 case studies in the region. Hopefully 2 additional will be added, and the aim there is to develop a roadmap for sustainable food production in the MENA region. It is funded by USAID, and the US partner is Purdue, and as well as additionally Texas A&M. The second project that I'd like to highlight is the one that is funded and in cooperation. Actually, it's not only funding, but we're working hand in hand with the International Renewable Energy Agency in Abu Dhabi, looking at the role of the renewable energy in the Nexus sustainability. And we're looking at specifically at what role renewable energy can play in sustainable water, in sustainable energy production, as well as in food. We will be, in fact, at the moment, we're developing the platform, and we'll be looking into 2 different case studies. One will be in the MENA region as compared to another one outside the MENA region as a comparison. I'd like to, before I close, I'd like to conclude with a few comments, which is kind of conclusions. Looking into, there are some Nexus tools that are available to allow us, to help us transform our decision-making process in integrative, holistic view. There are, and I presented one of those tools. I'd like to maybe look at specifically into the role of technology and the technology that are Nexus friendly, that will be suitable for helping us to make that transformation, and as well as the policy implication or Nexus friendly policy that will allow us to look into a holistic view of decision making. At the science side, one thing that was embedded in my presentation in the tool, but I didn't highlight it, that I'd like to stop at it from a hydrology standpoint. The hydrologic decision making has trickled down into our policy making, and our hydrology knowledge is based on stationary knowledge, which is the knowledge that uses the past to predict the future. This is no longer a luxury that we can afford, and we need to transform our decision making, not only our hydrologic understanding, but our decision making process into non-stationarity, where knowledge of the past may not allow us to predict the future. And I think this is very, very important as we move into a Nexus-friendly policy making. The other piece that I'd like to stop, which looking at the audience list, that such platform where policy and scientists are put together, I can't overemphasize the importance of this, where we really need to develop and facilitate further dialogue between policymakers and scientists. The other point that I'd like also to highlight, which is looking at the introductory comment I made, is very, I'd like to revisit that by looking at a holistic, integrated, inclusive, as well as multi-scale platform that allow us to look at all the stakeholders and all the major players as we move into a Nexus-friendly policymakers. As far as the government structure, I'd like to call for an intergovernmental structure that allow easy communication among the various units. Not to make here a political statement, because we don't need additional political statement in Lebanon, but I would urge, for example, the Ministry of Water and Energy to develop in Lebanon, to develop a more easier platform where the water strategy and the energy strategy can be integrated. And this is easier because it's they're all in that same building. Last but not least, we need to look into additional capacity in the R&D in a Nexus-friendly, so we need to invest more in R&D, in Nexus-friendly technology and Nexus-friendly understanding. Thank you so much. Again, I thank the organizers for putting this important session together and for giving me the opportunity to address you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mohtar. We especially thank you for being with us at such an early time. We will now take questions and comments for Professor Mohtar because he will not be with us later on.
Yes, hello, good morning, Rabi. This is Ralf Klingbeil from ESTWA. Thank you very much for your nice presentation.
Good morning, Ralf.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Thank you very much. I know, I mean, I've seen some of your presentations before, but what makes me thinking a little bit further is you already mentioned that you're intending to apply the tool for various countries, and of course that comes out of the situation of an existing governance structure. Whatever is the situation in the future and how they can be adapted to your web-based tool. I'm actually just wondering, could it be also a tool which can be applied in a country which more or less has lost its own internal governance structure and is searching a new way? Countries like Libya, maybe even what we are working on is as per the national agenda for the future of Syria. Are these options where we can involve maybe some national sector specialists in developing these tools for their countries?
Thank you, Ralf. This is a very important question. If you've noticed, I have not been talking about governments in the tool. I've been talking about governance, and I think it's a very important realization that you mentioned, that whoever is governing the water locally need to be involved in the decision-making process. You're absolutely right. I think in many of our government, either the decision-making platform is lacking or incapable of that crossover the boundary of the ministries. I think we need to be looking at governance of the resources instead of government control. You're absolutely right. And I think I would be delighted to speak to you about further, because I think the ESWA has a lot of experience working in this sector.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Mazen Amran from the University of Birmingham, United Kingdom. Regarding the tools that you presented, I'd like to know if you have factors, any uncertainties in the projection, because it seems it relies on the projection and the demands. Has uncertainties and risk been accounted in the tools, web tools developed? Thank you.
At the moment, the tool is a scenario based. So you include the scenario and you simulate it. And one of the ways we intend to include risk, which is very important, is through a Monte Carlo simulation where you introduce variability to any of the parameters. So the Nexus itself doesn't do it inherently. It's the way it's implemented within a bigger framework of a Monte Carlo or other risk tools.
Hi, I'm Maria. I'm studying political science actually for bachelor's. I have two questions. First, can you please define green water? Because I don't really know what it is. And second, you said that Lebanon is not yet on the platform. Who would be responsible of taking the decision to enter the project in the government? Thank you.
So let me answer the second part, which is the easier. We have been talking to ESWA, the Hariri Foundation, AUB, as well as others, for including a case study from Lebanon where the data can be collected locally through university cooperation, as well as ESWA and the Hariri Foundation participation through individual researchers and young scientists who will listen. Actually, it's the same case in the other situations. In Jordan, we are working with the University of Jordan. In Tunis, we're working also with a National Research Center, INCRAF. So we're not policy makers. We're all scientists in organizations that are working on developing and enhancing a tool that can be used by policymakers. So we're hoping that the tool will be used by policymakers. Regarding the green water is referred to the water that is within the VADO zone, and it is the water that can actually use for evapotranspiration demand. It is the water that many of us believe is underutilized, and many of us believe that this water is the water that is going to carry us to bridge the water gap in the future. Globally speaking, this water has been underestimated. I do believe that there's a lot of science that need to be developed to better understand the dynamics of soil water. We have Ralf models and rough understanding of these processes, the soil water processes that need to be improved, enhanced, and more importantly, scaled up. Because a lot of these are micro processes, and we need to develop the transformational tool, a scale-up tool that allow us to transform that understanding from a local soil water into larger scale at the landscape scale, at the policy scale.
Thank you, Dr. Mohtar. Yasser Abu Nasser, AUB. Thank you for presenting the tools. And it looks to me like this process of this tool is basically to put up the plan. But my question to you is, how do you go about with implementation later on? How do you account for the different trajectories that could actually happen? Or have you considered tipping points in the actual implementation process? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very good question. Knowing that this is a question that we will have to address at some point, we have invited and we will be inviting major stakeholders from the government, from the relevant government sector to the kickoff meeting, so that they actually are part of that discussion from day one. When we were accepting proposal, we actually had to make a we didn't need to, but we did request from each of the government relevant ministry, a commitment letter to cooperate with us in the project. So we do have letters of support from various ministries in the countries participating, that they will be part of the kickoff meeting, they will be part of setting up the scenario. As I mentioned, it is a scenario-based, so we have requested from each of the state and ministry to be part of the kickoff meeting to help us construct a meaningful scenario that can be useful for them as we move forward into implementation. But your point is extremely important. The relevant ministries, relevant governments, it may not be ministry, going back to Ralph's comment, which is very important, we needed to be working together with the relevant governments, water, energy, food governments, so that we are addressing the questions that are important to them. We need to be working with them in terms of what is critical in their mind, that when they first come to their office, what are they thinking of? What are their major challenges that we can help them address? Our role is not to impose on them a scenario. Our role is to show them what they're thinking about a problem, what are the ramifications to the other resources, and what are the implications, and at what cost their decision can be can affect the other resources. But your question is very important, and I think it needs to be continued in the thinking as we move forward in our project.
Thank you, Professor Mohtar. We thank you again for being with us. And now,
thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing all of you in Beirut. Thank you.
We will now have our third speaker, Ralf.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Chairperson, dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me and allowing me to speak here today for UNESCO. This presentation is built on a little paper which we have prepared earlier for another occasion, so it's actually not completely the full paper, but those who would like to have the more insight and all the references are most welcome to contact me or any of my co-authors. Rim Nejdavi is the chief of the new Food and Environmental Policy section at ESCWA. Fidel Virongiro, our Economic Affairs Officer, who unfortunately cannot be here today, but you're most welcome to contact me or even my other colleagues who are with us in the room. Just before we go into in depth into the substance of the presentation, for those who are not that familiar with ESCWA, ESCWA has currently 17 member countries. all over the Arab region. In particular, we enlarged over the last 2 years due to new members in North Africa, and I understand that there are more other countries about to join soon. But maybe we start on the food security and water security questions. I'm not so much addressing the energy issue, you will notice this, but I think we can probably address it further in the discussions later on. I would like to start with these two opening quotes. One goes quite a while back, and it's related to Socrates. I hope that is true. I think it is relating at least to the importance that wheat already played a major role at that time, and that nobody is qualified to become a statesman who is entirely ignorant of the problems of wheat. And I think in our region we are very much aware of this currently. And another little statement from a very good old friend of mine. I just had him on the Skype yesterday, but there are no water wars because food wars are not judged to be necessary. That already dates back to 1981. In the 70s, he claimed that this water already ran out of water, that this region ran out of water and already imports most of their needs through virtual water. And I think we will come to that also later on. Short outline for what we will talk about in the next minutes. I don't go very much into depth on the definitions because that's a bit dry and you can look it up later. The presentation will be available. Water security, food security. I want to address a little bit main challenges and opportunities because I think in the moment while we still see it as a challenge, there are many ways of using it as opportunity to become a more greener environment, to become a more greener economy and a much more sustainable future for our countries in this region. So I want to talk about food losses and food waste, something which was in both of the other presentations also addressed but not so much focused on, and I want to use a few examples. The trade issue, which I think is very important to secure food in the region. So it's not only the local production but the trading and how to find the best benefit. And then particularly the issue of how to and where to improve value chains and some ways forward maybe. But before we start, what concerns us all very much, particularly also here in Lebanon, is the current situation in our neighboring country in Syria. And a lot of people address the issue particularly because of some social or economic issues and relate the basis of this actually as a reason for the current crisis. But more and more actually it becomes accepted that it is not only a social or an economic issue which caused people to stand up and wanted to ask for some more participation. It actually is also related to a very serious drought, not necessarily directly connected to climate change, but of course also related. A drought over the years of 2006 or at least 2008 to 2010, different UN organizations, including FAO, I see the colleague here also, World Food Programme, have called loudly to the world to stop and assist, and nobody listened. There was a huge drought all over the northeast of Syria, most of Syria and also parts of Iraq, and a lot of people started moving away from their homes. So they actually started being internally displaced persons, not due to violence, but because they couldn't make a living out of their land anymore. And this was not only because of the drought, but it was also related to many other factors. And you can actually go through, we have a huge population growth still in Syria, although it is declining, but it's still very high. We have drought and water scarcity. We talk about water shortages, crop failures, natural resources mismanagement. I really have to spell it out. There was a lot of things which didn't went the way they wanted to do. Climate change, internal displacement, rural disaffection, political unrest, ... So where does it go when we don't take care of our resource base in a more sustainable manner? I want to use this as a starting point because I think it shows where actually the challenges lie. It's not only a social and economic issue in the moment in the region. It is basically also a resource question, how we better manage our water, land, and energy resources. We've talked about the food, water, energy nexus as a whole already. When we talked about it, I thought a little bit coming out of a water environment, out of the integrated water resources management, which is understood actually more as a process. Maybe we should also see the nexus more as a process, a kind of the nexus better seen as a process, not necessarily as a final optimized status, but rather an ongoing, continuous review process on how to optimize a complex system of variables in a holistic manner to generate the ideal co-benefits for a society at a given time. Because tomorrow you might see it from a different angle, and the day after again. So I think there is a need to have an ongoing process of all our governance actions related to resources and people. And here I've blown up the triangle a little bit, because I think in our region we have other resources which are very important. And these are the people. But unfortunately, people are not always enabled to actually contribute to this, either because of human capacities, limited human capacities, or because of the participatory and the governance structures in a given circumstance. So I think there is a whole range of actors, how that interlinks, and we will come to this later again. So now we can go into the definitions, and I mean, of course, food security has been, there are various attempts to define it, but I think I go back to the 2009 definition, which actually based food security, I don't want to go into the detail, but based it on 4 main pillars. The process is ongoing, and in the process towards the development of the Sustainable Development Goals next year, or until 2015, the process has moved into broadening this, looking at food security under various different dimensions. I mean, we have the dimensions, but we also, there are a number of indicators, food security indicators, which are under discussion. This is still an ongoing process, and this is now from, I think, September last year, with FAO, IFAD, and WFP particularly leading this dialogue. On water security, we had a similar approach, but within the water community, under the umbrella of UN Water. I think nowadays 28 UN agencies working collaboratively to assist on a common way of addressing water issues. There is a definition on water security, also from last year. They made a nice little poster which actually indicates the various components of how water is interacting with our daily life. There is, of course, a transboundary cooperation outside, but then there are many, many factors inside affecting the way how we can handle water more sustainably. Not only the resource itself, but governance issues, financing, and other issues. Let's go a little bit more specifically on various sectors or issues. I would like to address the food losses and waste. And starting with this little diagram, actually it was from the last year's UN World Environment Day on the 5th of June. The idea to actually work towards reducing the waste of food or the losses along the food value chain. This is maybe an eye-opener, which I discovered also at the same time last year. The Qatar Statistics Authority, through the local paper, was quoted with a statement that more than half of the municipal waste generated contains discarded food. I have now been in contact with colleagues at the Qatar Statistics Authority, and I understand that that the figure might be not exactly true, but it is understood that there is a large percentage of municipal waste which is actually related to food, not only to organic waste. And that, of course, is of concern if that is actually still usable. Going the next step, I mean, we all, particularly those who work in agricultural or water issues nowadays, are very much aware of the questions raised along the whole food value chain, and you can actually start with somewhere in the field that you actually on the green side, on the left side, it's more called food losses, whereas along the value chain to the consumption, you're actually starting to talk about food waste. There are various factors which impact on losses and waste along this chain, and often it is actually not very clear how much is lost where. You can lose energy, you can lose water by just using it inefficient all along the way. And unfortunately, we have not many cases who actually have been able to monitor the losses along the chain. And I think that's something where I will come back to later again, because I think there is a need to do more research on trying on example value chains to really dig out what is the loss for this kind of product in a given country compared to another country, for example. Also. But now go one step further. If you look at the production volumes per commodity group, I'm now particularly looking at the cereal group on the left-hand side. The North Africa, West and Central Asia group, which is actually the Third from the right on the bar chart. The total production volumes are not so high in this region. So actually the region already, and we know this, depends a lot on food imports from outside. At the same time, when we now blow it up a little bit and look at only the cereal food losses, we discover that actually the losses in this region are rather high. Even though the region requires a lot of imports of food, particular cereals, this imported cereal, we are not dealing with it adequately compared to the high value we should allocate to a resource which we had to import. And here is actually a split of different consumption, distribution, processing, post-harvest, and agricultural losses. And it's interesting, although this region is larger than now the Middle East and North Africa alone, or the Arab countries, interesting in this group that the agriculture and the early post-harvest losses are relatively high compared to the other parts, in particular also compared to often quoted Europe or North America. Because that already shows that particularly on the food losses and waste side, we cannot easily compare us always according to what has been researched and the science developed only in Europe and North Africa. We have to work on our own data to improve our own understanding. Now, the food losses and food waste also contain other losses. I mean, one of the losses, for example, is when we lose food and food waste, we actually increase our carbon footprint. For Great Britain, there was a study just over last year, I think it was published, that you can actually quote the total losses of food linked to about 25 billion or 26 billion tons of CO2 as a carbon footprint, of which maybe 22 are supposed to be avoidable waste and 78 are possibly avoidable waste. That's a kind of relative decision what you want to call it, but I think the total number of carbon dioxide created through waste, which is actually not coming to any productive use in that way, it's a bit shocking. I mean, you can go and differentiate what kind of product it is, but everybody knows it's particular meat products. Now, of course, comes a nutritionist and will tell me, but the meat has a higher nutritional value, and that is okay, and it's important. And I think it's important to actually start having a balance check. Where is what kind of benefit? We haven't done that yet, particularly not for our countries. Food losses and food waste, the total water footprint, again, a calculation for the UK out of the same study. It's just published, and that's why I had to correct. There was a mistake in the graphs for that particular publication. It's actually 6 billion cubic meters of water which are lost through food waste in the UK. It's a huge number. Now you have to transfer it, of course, to the per capita losses and. But I don't want to say that this is the figure which is relevant for us. I want to point out we don't have the data in our region. We should actually work on creating this data for our countries. And thanks to the opportunity to be here at one of the universities or leading universities in the region, I would really like to encourage you to also look into these ways. But it's not only clearly the resources losses. We have economic impacts along the supply chain. By the losses of food and waste, this is a study from Italy, we have waste in agriculture, we have waste in industry, we have waste in distribution. Added up, the country of Italy per year loses about nearly 13 billion euros. It doesn't sound like this is something Italy has to ignore in the current period. So I think that there is not only the physical losses of a resource or a contribution to environmental concern, there is a real economic loss which should be of concern to a much wider audience than only the environment people. Water losses, water issues. I mean, we all are aware of the various approaches to agricultural water use in our region. These are just 3 time slices from a particular area in Wadi al-Sirhan, Saudi Arabia, and not too far away from Jordan. Agricultural water use has expanded over many, many years. And also in Saudi Arabia, everybody has understood that this cannot really go on this way because at some stage, the aquifers are depleted. This is, for example, an example of a cumulative adding up per different regional aquifer over a period from 1975 to 2004 of accumulated consumption of the water stored or in that reserve. I wouldn't call it not at all renewable. Most of them are actually non-renewable resources. So actually it's taking up until it is not feasible anymore to pump. Well, this is a good opportunity to have a little advertising break, because when I talk about large-scale aquifers, I would also like to point out that ESCWA has been involved until last year and launched last year a major study for the region, the so-called inventory of shared water resources in Western Asia. It links to also the food security aspect, because a lot of the large aquifers actually have transboundary components. This was done together with the German Development Corporation under the Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources in Hanover, and was launched in September. It contains plenty of information and data from various aquifers and surface basins, so you're most welcome to review this further. So advertising break is over. Let's come to the next point, the trade. When we talk about trade, maybe one diagram shows the situation. This is the pre-2010 situation, and comes from our Economic Development and Globalization division in ESCWA. When you see this diagram, you actually have on the lower dimension, you have deficit or surplus price risk or fiscal balances. So actually countries which are higher in the surplus can easily absorb price risks of trading food. Whereas on the left-hand side, we see a quantity risk. Which countries have a surplus situation of food production in the country compared to a deficit? And I pointed it out as pre-2010 because current situation of Syria is of course not this. Otherwise, the World Food Programme wouldn't have to try to feed about half the population from outside. But it shows the variety. The big dots, the size of the dots actually is a relative to the World Hunger Index in the countries. So I think it should show the complexity of the situation, that it is not easy to come up with one answer for each of the countries. Each country has a different need for an answer, and also a different need for an answer at a given time. This one goes again into the surplus and deficit discussions, and might be a good starting point, because I mean here in our region we often debate, can we not do more within the trade within our region? Is it not enough to supply us all with food? I know that even in ESCWA we debated, but I personally think the deficit in this region is the world's largest deficit on food. And it's very difficult to find a way to accommodate all these food needs from within the Arab region. At the same time, there is a lot of opportunities to better cooperate, better trade between Arab countries and improve the situation. This is just a little slideshow for 3 countries, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, showing the average annual wheat imports over a period of 4 years. And I mean, here's the average for all 3 together. It shows a little bit where these 3 countries source their wheat from, their main cereal. When we move it further, of course, every of these movements of wheat contains water. So we have here the virtual net water importers. The more red, the more net water importers are there on this map. It's based on the water footprint of humanity. I mean, even a lot of European countries are actually flagged very much red, but we all know that they have many well-developed, maybe not always fair, trade agreements with other countries. And you might have heard it last year, the European Union representative for agriculture has announced to cut a lot of the agricultural subsidies for allowing better trade, also imports from other countries. So we are looking forward for these changes, because I think a lot of our MENA countries are also interested in better trade agreements. Particularly in our ESCWA member countries, I think it's based not on today, but maybe before our joining of the other 3 countries, there is quite a large increase over time from 1980 to 2010 about the net cereal imports in million tons, particularly compared to the other regions in the world. These countries are much more increasing the need of cereal imports over that time. One little example I want to go through, this is the wheat production, consumption, and trade in Saudi Arabia. And it shows a little bit of one of the largest countries in the region, how wheat and water use have closely been connected to the trade policies and governance system dealing with the whole situation. It shows from the left to the right, 1983 to 2019, what is supposed to be the future according to today's developments. it lists up on the red line, in the end, the total wheat production in the country. It's a huge peak for a period of time, then suddenly it drops. It stays with the blue line. This light blue line is actually the consumption line. So in the period between 1996-97 to 2007, Saudi Arabia produced more or less the volumes of wheat they needed for their own consumption. But before they produced much more. Actually, they produced so much that they became, I think, the fourth largest wheat exporter in the world. They recognized that that cannot go on like this because it draws again from the water of the aquifers and draws on their future sustainability. But I mean, at the same time, there is a next step that even later on, since the food consumption, the wheat consumption continued to increase, in 2006, 2007, 2008, there was a decision of phasing out wheat production in the country, and suddenly you see a drop of the wheat production and actually an increase of import. And if you look at this, it's amazing how a country can shift from the 90s, from being one of the largest wheat exporters in the world, to a system now which becomes one of the largest, or already is one of the, next to Egypt, one of the largest food importers in the world. This is an example, I mean, that shows trade on agro projects can work. I mean, these are examples of UAE agreeing with various countries on trading food. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we will see. So far, some of these have been developed, but not all of them have been able to actually bring the benefits to the agreeing parties. Improving food value chains, the last part of the presentation. Can I still have 2-3 minutes? Thank you. It was good, they were just talking. Green value chains, or improving these value chains, would address, or the characteristics of it would address socio-economic and environmental development. It allows for higher income in rural areas. It allows for job creation in the whole value chain. It allows for more equity and conservation. While global companies normally or increasingly looking at issues such as safety, fairness, and etc. So they are following fairness rules or trying to label their products very much as a fair trade or other activities. This was not particular advertising for any particular organization. There are many of these around. But the aspect is that more and more global companies, food companies, try to actually ensure that their product is more sustainable, more greener. So that means actually at the global level there is a whole development with the big companies who what is already improving things, and at local level we see already it trickling down that a lot of NGOs also in Lebanon and here in the region are developing local approaches to develop performance standards or various approaches to this. Given the continuously rising global ramifications, in the end countries will have to adapt. They cannot stay out of this, otherwise they have no chance to trade their products. And I mean, when we follow the debate about the potato exports from Lebanon over the last years, it's a very clear example that by improving the potato quality and then making sure that this is actually heard outside, it had an effect that also Lebanon potatoes can be traded in the European Union again. But of course we have to follow up and keep the standards high of the product. It covers economic, social, environmental, and institutional issues, and as such, it allows the countries actually to move out of a more low value added, low cost sector, like here's the example of Morocco in 1980, then the drop even further, but in Morocco 2010 we see actually that all these, the vegetable market for export in Morocco has highly contributed, or has led to a much high value added and differentiated market, which actually led to a higher position and competitive nearly with some South European countries or Turkey, Egypt. Ways forward. I think we need to see, and we have to look for much more holistic approaches to the management of resources that touches on not only the water, where there is this tradition for quite a while, but I think the integrated holistic view on all the resources. We have to look into better international trade and regional cooperation agreements. We also should focus primarily on local vulnerable population to actually encourage local level initiatives for the whole value chains. And then the support for research related to food security and food-related conflicts. I think I mentioned some aspects which might be picked up by one or the other in AOB already. Equitable and just international trade relations. And the last point, I think we need more accountable governments, not only governance. You need more accountable governments, not further ignoring the plight of the rural and disadvantaged and poor. Otherwise, I'm not sure where we will end. I mean, most of you who have listened to Eckhard Würz's lecture here, I think a year ago or half a year ago, probably know this and his other talk and his book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we will have the last presentation by Dr. Farajalla. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you for being patient and waiting for this. I'll try to be brief. It's always difficult to be last, and especially following Ralf's nice presentations with all the images. What we're coming down to here is I'm bringing you back to Lebanon and the status of our institutions and what we are dealing with in Lebanon with an outlook on the nexus. The presentation here is derived from an ongoing study we're conducting at the Climate Change and the Environment Program at the IFI. And I need to recognize, before I go any further, the co-authors that have worked very hard, especially Patricia Idamus, Silva Kerkisian, and Rana Al-Haj. We've all worked on this, plus an anonymous worker who doesn't want to be recognized, but he knows himself. We've put in a lot of effort, and I just want to refer to a slide that Holger did not present, but he presented back in Bonn, to indicate just where the stresses are in our economy. This is the basic nexus outlook, if you want to look at it. And we have global trends or stressors that we are feeling here in Lebanon. And I just want to quantify these quickly. Basically, Lebanon's population growth rate is slowing down tremendously. It's at around 0.7%. But the number of people in Lebanon is large. It's 4.4 million now, expected to rise to 5.2 million in 2030. That's exclusive of the immigrants and the displaced people that are coming into Lebanon from neighboring conflicts. The urban population growth rate is 0.9% compared to the rural population growth rate, which is a negative. People are moving out of the rural areas. Urban population is 87% of people in Lebanon. Population density ranges between anywhere, if you look at the population in Lebanon, anywhere between 397 persons per square kilometer. Some even say that it's 404. The CIA ranks us at 20th. If you look at Wikipedia, we are 10th. And this is quite a ranking, high ranking for a country like Lebanon. Plus, we are having an increasing economic growth, which is putting further stress on our resources. Climate is also putting stress on our resources. If you look at all the different data that we're looking at, we expect temperatures to increase and precipitation to decrease, especially when we're looking at snow. If we look at just this chart, the minimum temperature in Lebanon over the past 125 years or so has increased by nearly 3 degrees Celsius. That's a very, very large number. What about the Lebanese sectors? If we look at the water sector, the demand, 60% of our fresh water goes to agriculture, 29% goes to domestic use, and 11% goes to industry. The total renewables are sources per person are 926 million cubic meters. This is below the 1,000 cubic meter level, and that goes a little bit against what Holger is saying, that we are more or less better endowed. There are few countries that are better endowed than Lebanon. We are expected, this number is expected to drop to around 839 million cubic meter per person by 2015, next year. The problem with our water supplies, it's discontinuous. We feel it now, we felt it in summer, and we're experiencing our first drought in a few years, I believe. Infrastructure is old and outdated in some areas, and in others it's poorly maintained. On the energy sector, 77% of the total demand is being met by what is produced in Lebanon. 23 is through generators, and you can think of private generators, and you can think of the pollution that is causing. Food-wise, we are well situated in the global hunger index. We're below 5, which is good, low hunger. But the agricultural sector only covers 20% of our food demand, and we import the rest. 80% of our cereal is imported, red meat 82%, fish is 75%, dairy is 37%. So that puts us in a vulnerable position to any fluctuations in the food market. And this is also reflected in that about 15 to 20% of people in Lebanon are experiencing some kind of food insecurity. This is not a small number. Just to show you a brief slide that is interesting, we found interesting. If we look at the red line, which is the crude oil prices over the past few years, you can see where we are in, it is stable, and food production, cereal production in Lebanon is matching that, it's stable. In 2006, we got the Israeli war on us, and our cereal production dropped. And it picked up as the oil prices were going down. And you can see that wheat yields increase as oil prices decrease. That allows, that sort of you hearken into irrigation being a key supporter of increased yield, and irrigation in Lebanon relies heavily on pumping from groundwater. That's where we are at. These are the descriptors and the stresses that we are suffering. And when moving into institutions, we looked at institutions that are pertinent to each of the sectors that we're looking at, and to see how they are structured and whether there can be any form of overlay. And we'll move into this in a little bit. In the Ministry of Energy and Water, it is made up of 3 directorates, the most pertinent of which for our case here is the Directorate of Hydraulic and Electrical Resources, and it's divided into the following if you want, groups, which is there's an administration side, there's a studies, I don't know what the translation to it in English is, but there's a studies group, and the water, where under water we have the irrigation studies and projects. We've got the planning unit and electrical equipment and the environment aspect. That, when we bring it down to more focus, the Ministry of Energy and Water is tasked with water policies, coming up with water policies and strategies, developing action plans, setting out regulations, and overseeing the water establishments that run the water sector in Lebanon. And basically it is the water resource manager. The water establishments, they are regional, there are 4 of those, and they operate the systems and they maintain them. They oversee some of the irrigation plans in their areas, and they collaborate and oversee local committees. These are not now, some are functional, some are not, but they don't have any legal status. The Litani River Authority is the authority responsible for rivers in Lebanon, not only the Litani, and the planning and operation of all facilities on those rivers. Municipalities, this is where there's a gray area here. The wastewater collection is worked through the institutions, and the operation and maintenance of these, plus the small irrigation schemes within those. On the energy side of the Ministry of Energy and Water, we've got Electricité du Liban, the Lebanese Center of Energy Conservation, and the private concessions. We have the Zahli one, Alay, Jbel. These are examples of private concessions that are given by the government. And when we look at the Ministry of Agriculture, under the Ministry of Agriculture, there is the Director General who oversees the Directorate of Studies and Coordination. This is not really active right now. There is the Directorate of Agricultural Resources, of Animal Resources, Rural Development and Natural Resources, and Regional Services. And under the minister also, we've got some institutes that are quite active. We've got the Lebanese Agricultural Research Institute, the Green Plan, the Higher Council for Agriculture, and the Planning and Coordination Body. So it is quite integrated. And then when we look at the Ministry of Environment, since we're looking at climate change and mainstreaming also is a core stressor, and it is climate change policies are being, or people are trying to mainstream climate change policies into our general strategies. Under the Minister of Environment, we have now a Higher Council of the Environment, and then under him also the General Director, who oversees the service of regional departments and environmental policies, service of planning, programming, etc. All these departments under that. So this is the structure that we're looking at in terms of the government. How does it look like when we see under each sector where they are attached? So there are, for the water sector, the direct line ministries and related agencies. We've got Ministry of Energy and Water, the regional establishments, and all the regional and councils that fall within it, establishments. For the energy, and if we move further down in the list, there are no councils that are directly related to water, but there are centers within the government structure, if you will. There is the Lebanese Center for Water and Wastewater Management, the Lebanese Water Conservation Center, and then we move over to the energy. Again, the ministry is there with EDL as the prime unit, and then these other councils, some of which have an NGO status. For the Ministry of Agriculture, we've got the Green Plan as an institute, and Larry, they are involved directly, but then we move into the councils, where they start factoring in not through the agricultural production per se, but through land use. For example, the Higher Council for Urban Planning has an input into land use. National Council for Quarries, again, land use. The Higher Council for Hunting, that's involved in agriculture in terms of preservation of biodiversity as well. The Industrial Research Institute and the Lebanese Agriculture Research Institute are some of the centers that we work with that we can tag into the food and agriculture sectors. There are indirect ministries that work through this. These are the Ministry of Finance. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. It works with all the ministries. There's if you will, the roles of different ministries under different others. But we look at the Ministry of Social Affairs as well as the Ministry of Public Health and the Ministry of Interior and Municipalities. These are the ministries that have indirect roles in policies and strategies within the government. So if we look at the institutional integration, we're looking at the nexus approach. We need to see how integrated this whole setup is. And if you look at it on paper, it looks decent. I mean, common to all three, we've got the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Energy and Water, Ministry of Environment, the Council for Development and Reconstruction, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economy and Trade. These are all common. They have dealings with all these three. So this is a nice setup. If you look at just water and agriculture, we have a whole slew. We've got the Green Plan, the water establishments, Ministry of Public Health, Ministry of Interiors and Municipalities, the Lebanese Water Conservation Center, LARI. These are common to these three. And then agriculture alone has the Higher Council for Quarries, and Ministry of Social Affairs doesn't deal much with any of the other two sectors. And the LCEC, ODL, and the private concessions are particular to the energy sector. This leads us to think that when strategies or policies come out of such a structure, one would aim, I mean, not just looking at the face of it, one would think that, well, there would be a lot of cooperation or an end result, whereas there is a lot of integration in policies. But when we look at it, look at the core, it's empty. There is not much that is related to each of the different sectors. The commonalities between water and agriculture are extensive. We've got in both, when we looked at the water strategy that was produced and the older agriculture strategy, there are some cross-links. For example, both strategies talked about irrigation. The agriculture strategy talked about seed selection, seeking drought-resistant or drought-tolerant crops. The reforestation plan came from the Ministry of Agriculture, Hill Lakes as well. The National Land Use Plan, that's overseen by the CDR, also factors in here, as well as the Hassad project. Water and energy, even though they are housed in the same ministry, their overlap is much limited to dams and hydropower. So there is this lack of connection. And energy and and agriculture, nothing. There is not much in terms of ministerial connections. I will just skim over the strategies and the processes that were developed. The water strategy, the policymaking process was inclusive. Nearly all ministries and relevant stakeholders were invited to participate at an earlier stage, and as well as international donor communities. Comments were taken into consideration from these stakeholders. The contact that was initiated was based on a one-to-one relationship. It was not an institutional relationship per se, and so that played a lot of personal contacts played a large role. In the energy policy paper, it was led by advisors within the Ministry of Energy and Water. Stakeholders were brought in at a later stage, and the policy draft was circulated later on to the main stakeholders for approval and comments before finalization. So it was not integrated from the get-go. Agriculture was the least integrated of all. It started out internally and was produced internally through technical committees from within the ministries and within the different directors of the ministries. The multi-stakeholder approach was also within the ministry. The directorates and the organizing decisions were within that. What do we think of all this? I mean, this is where we brought in all these, we threw at you different institutions, policies, etc. What do we make out of all this? First and foremost, when we look at institutions, it's about the people that are in it. There are vacancies within the ministries that we're talking about that are huge gaps. For example, only 15% of positions in the Ministry of Energy and Water are occupied, 77 out of 505. The rest are, I mean, people can do only so much. Personnel within ministries are not empowered or do not feel that they have the freedom of expression when they go to meetings unless they are given that right by ministers or by their director generals, and that's very rare. So when a representative of the Ministry of Agriculture goes into a meeting for strategy planning in terms with, let's say, Ministry of Energy and Water, they cannot make a statement committing the ministry to anything. So they just are basically observer status and reporters of facts, nothing more. They don't give an opinion, maybe, or they don't commit to any action. Functionality, when we look at functionality of the setup, there is a discontinuity, basically because and no institutional memory, basically because of the vacancies that there are, where it is these vacancies are replaced by donor organizations. In our case in Lebanon, mainly it's the UNDP coming in and putting in personnel in ministries. These UNDP people leave, and there is nothing left after they leave. So this is something that is quite critical. There is no coordination protocol between institutions that is clear and transparent and effective. There is no coordination at times within the same ministry. Energy and water is a great example. There is no common method for setting strategies. This is not typical of Lebanon, this is everywhere. But there is not one standard method of setting it up. Legally, the communication between ministries has to go through the Director General or through the Minister. So it goes up. From one unit, it goes up to the Director General. The Director General or Minister contacts the other Director General or Minister, who contacts his unit or her unit, and then instead of the units contacting each other and streamlining that has to go back and forth. And there are lots of political problems in Lebanon that this contact between ministers at times is lost. Also then, more on a technical basis, the data that is being used or shared is of question. The quality is questionable. Data sharing is questionable as well. Some people sit on their data, they don't share it. And the uniformity of data in terms of scale and temporal or spatial scale is also problematic. So these are the issues that we have identified. Small recommendations, and these typically fall in line with what was brought up earlier. Institutionally, we need to reorganize and empower the existing planning bodies within ministries. We don't really need to create new bodies. We need to use those that are there and make them work better through legal and institutional initiatives, and this way that we can guide towards a more, if you will, nexus approach, integrated approach. We need to improve and decentralize the communication between ministries. We need to create, in a sense, as well, if when possible, a planning body to develop the capacities of planning bodies within, such as councils or higher councils that help integrate all these ministries together. And also, very important is that to develop the capacities of concerned stakeholders in nexus planning. That is of paramount importance. We need to educate people to bring them up and make them, empower them through education and knowledge. On the policy level, we need to improve the level of integration of policies. We cannot keep doing things alone and then telling people after the fact that this is what we've done, what do you think? And then we have to improve the resource efficiency factors within the different sector strategies. Resource efficiency is critical when we're addressing the three sectors we're talking about. And then, falling back on what was brought up earlier, we need to undertake sustainability assessment or strategic environmental assessment for all sector strategies. This is critical. This forces, in an indirect manner, this development of integration and looking into different outputs from the different strategies. And with this, I thank you.
We will have a discussion now.
Before we have our discussion, we are lucky to have today among us Mr. Abdul Tayyar, who is advisor to the Minister of Water and Energy, and we will take this opportunity actually to invite you to comment on what was just presented by Nadim.
Thank you very much. Rather than commenting, I would like to add a few things from my recent experience in Lebanon, in having the chance to work on the development of the National Water Sector Strategy, or also my experience in the region, mainly in the GCC countries. First, for Lebanon, yes, as Nadim mentioned, we had really a serious consultative approach, and many of you present here, some of you present here, have been involved in this process. So what we did initially, and even before starting to develop the strategy, when putting the scope of work, we engaged all local, national stakeholders, all that have any relation with the water sector, in a discussion, in a dialogue. In addition to also donor agencies, because we rely so much also on the donor agencies in the water sector. In particular, we had a close coordination with the Ministry of Agriculture. So discussing with them irrigated areas, cropping patterns, crop water requirements, etc. So this was one of the main inputs into the strategy. We also looked at interrelations interconnections between water and energy. And I have to say, in Lebanon, as outlined in the presentation, this interconnection is still small currently. It materializes only in hydropower for now. Hydropower currently is around 5%, contributes to 5% of our energy production. So this is the amount of interconnection. We are working also on the use of treated sewage effluents. That's really also a material example of the interconnection between water, energy, and food, because the plan is, wherever technically feasible, is to use this treated effluent for irrigation, some kinds of irrigation. This approach, really, we didn't have the word nexus in our mind when we developed this. We had some common sense, and we really believed that we need to think in an integrated manner. And this is what we did. So the dialogue really had this nexus or the integrated planning factored in, and this is what we did. The National Water Sector Strategy was approved by Council of Ministers in March 2012, and we are currently implementing this strategy. Now, a couple of words just to do a small comparison between Lebanon and the GCC countries. Where in Lebanon, still the relations are a bit limited, but the situation in the Gulf is different. GCC countries have little renewable water resources, so less than 100 cubic meters per capita per annum, around 90 or 92 cubic meters. So they largely rely on energy to produce water. They are the global leaders in desalination. So desalination or desalinated water is the biggest source of water in GCC. And this has a high economic and environmental cost. Seawater desalination, to produce 1 cubic meter of desalinated water, causes 8 times more energy than to pump groundwater. And it requires up to 25% of total energy needs in some countries of the region. So in addition, on the environmental front, this has contributed to the GCC country status as one of the highest carbon emitting regions in the world. And despite all this, and this is the weird thing about the GCC, despite all this, GCC countries consume about 65% more water than the world average. For example, in the UAE, the water supply only, I'm not talking about irrigation or something, water supply only is around 650 liters per capita per day, where we know that averages are in the 150s, a bit more, a bit less. Agriculture in the GCC countries accounts for around 80% of total water demand. So why do we have this? Why is this planning or mislinking between consumption and supply? Of course, the region's climate, the arid climate in the region, is certainly one of the drivers, but there are a lot of also man-made factors in this. In the future, trends show that if the business as usual scenario is kept, the deficit will be larger, the gap between supply and demand will be larger, and energy needs will be much larger. So way forward, I don't want to use the National Water Sector Strategy as a leading example, but I mean common sense is the example. So integrated planning should be adopted to resolve water, energy, and food interconnected challenges in the region to ensure greater sustainability. And to do this, we need to. This is not easy. The process is very complex. So many factors, so many players, so many requirements come into play. So we need to look at demand-side improvements, supply-side improvements, and the case for Lebanon and a number of countries in the region is institutional strengthening. This is just a small note. And for the presentation that Nadim, the dialogue that was hosted was not only just one-to-one, it was institutional. The invitations were sent to all ministries, councils, authorities that worked in the water sector or had relation with the water sector, and official representatives were appointed. So we wanted to have this character, not only just a coordination thing, but also an institutional coordination. Thank you.
We'll have
Well, my name is Adil Kortas, former Minister of Agriculture in Lebanon. I learned a lot today about food security and waters. Really, I thank you very much for this invitation. However, I would like to draw your attention to specific points. First of all, when we speak about the population of Lebanon, and we put the figure of 4.2, we forget about the number of refugees we have in Lebanon and the number of tourists we have in Lebanon. So at least you have to add 1.5 million people to the figure of 4.2. This is number one. Number two, when we speak about natural resources, we speak about water, but we forget about forestry, and about pasture land. Don't forget that according to our Census of Agriculture, we have about 750,000 hectares of pasture land, while the land under agriculture is not more than 250,000. Therefore, and this is very, very important when we see the relationship between natural resources production and livestock production. The Awasi, which is the best race of sheep we have in the region and even the world, the Awasi sheep is roaming all around Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Turkey, and Iraq, and following the pasture land of these. Therefore, we have to pay attention to this. Finally, I would like to draw your attention that today, the New York Times, Thomas Friedman has produced a very good editorial about the relationship between drought in Syria and what's going on in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these comments. I will just give a very brief response so there's more room for other questions to be discussed. But the issue you raise about land use for various agricultural purposes, including grazing, sheep grazing, that relates back to the question that was in the audience about green water before. There's a very close link between water management, between land management and water productivity, you may say. There's an earlier publication that I can show you if you're interested that says every land use decision is also a water use decision. Whether you allow this water to raise your sheep, or to grow cherry trees or olive trees, or whether you let it be unused by allowing to grow cities over it. That makes a lot of difference in a water-scarce situation. And in many places, in many instances, there's not close attention being paid to the water consequences of your land management, so that deserves attention.
Yes, Rita Jdali from ESCO. I noticed, Dr. Holger, when you presented the tools to use for this nexus, you presented the LEAP, the WEAP, water, and the energy tools. Is there a fruit tool that has been produced? And you said that the three sectors together, the nexus of the three sectors, and we know that food is not a one sector, but you presented it always from the production side. So it's more agriculture, it's the land part of it. If we're talking about food, that is an added complexity to the nexus, because the food issue by itself is a complex issue. I just have two more comments. The political priorities of our region has to come into this nexus as well, to be a workable mechanism for us to think of policies. And because we don't have business as usual in this region, and specifically right now, with all the changes, how are we able to use such a nexus? We need something more flexible, quick, maybe to meet the immediate priorities. Now that we are talking about the post-2015 era, which the world is shifting the development into a new paradigm, food security comes as really one of the most debatable issues when we talk about sustainable development goals for the post-2015 era. I know that during Bonn this was discussed how we can have this nexus discussed in the outcome document of Rio Plus 20, but it was not part of it. Now that the discussions come to sustainable development goals, and as ESCWA are really engaged in this process at the global and at the regional level, how can we talk about the nexus in this post-2015 era?
Actually, I have a couple of comments, and although I promised Ralf not to be critical, I will pose some controversial issues. On the issue of drought in Syria, I think this issue is being given more than its weight, actually. If I could say that I have credible information saying that what's happening in Syria politically has been planned and prepared for at least 2 years in advance. And we'll not go into this political discussion, but there are real facts and information available. If we go to the issue of the movement of people, several GIZ projects were working in Syria and have indicated that the population dynamics are affected by the absence of government services, the same thing that's happening in Lebanon, but we didn't have a revolution in Lebanon, although we deserve one. But again, when you look at Turkey and how it took a major part of the water as a regional power, a major part of the water which is going into Syria and Iraq, we might ask questions. Where did the water pressure come from in Syria? Is it because of taking the water to the dams, to the giant dams in Turkey, or is it because of the drought which happens and used to happen occasionally? So this is one of the issues that need to be mentioned. On the issue of the needs or the need for global increase in production and increasing efficiency of production, I would like to bring you back to the report that was mentioned by FAO, given by FAO some 4 years ago, about the food losses globally. Again, the world, unfortunately, is not equitable in the distribution of resources, but when we look, or when we see that the developed countries waste at least 1/3 of their food by the consumers, and thank you, Ralf, for putting the figures on the screen here, the red ones, that show how much food is being wasted. Again, we cannot talk about increasing efficiency, rather we should be talking about a more equitable distribution of resources. Otherwise, we're doomed, since we are talking about a global problem, not a country problem. The last one, and I will not take more time, on the issue of the water in Lebanon. I think this illusion and misconception that's being regularly broadcasted and maintained that Lebanon is rich in water. Where is Marcus from here? Did he leave? I mean, all the reports about the water and precipitation in Lebanon indicate that half of the water goes to the Mediterranean. If we add into it the uncontrolled urban sprawl and what's happening to the water which is landing on the urban areas, again ending up in the sea, we would easily conclude that we don't have much water. Again, this misconception has led to an event or an initiative which is being supported by some capitalists in this country that are willing to sell water and are intending to sell water to other countries, and this is, again, in the opinion of many people in this country, not rational and not acceptable. Since we are coming and we have a future problem of water in this country, so the issue of exporting water is a bit crazy at this stage. Thank you.
I'm Maria Zaid from the Food and Agriculture Organization. My question is regarding the Lebanese policy, water policy. We're a country with very poor infrastructure. We have not achieved cost recovery whatsoever. We have no maintenance of pipelines. We're getting thousands of refugees every day. We have no political stability. Why are we switching to supply policy rather than demand policy? Why don't we give incentives for people to consume less water rather than trying to build dams and causing maybe negative environmental impacts? And my other question is, where is the policy of the Lebanese Ministry of Water regarding groundwater resources, and particularly transboundary groundwater resources, if any? Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. I will try to be very brief in my responses. First of all, the tools I've shown, called WEEP and LEAP, I encourage you to look at them, what they do. They're not the only tools around, but they have been used widespreadly. They do address food to the extent that we have allocate water and energy to the various sectors, including the food sector, but they are not food tools per se. Interestingly, I went last year to the Ministry of Water and Energy and discussed with them these tools, and there was some significant interest to use them also as standard tools in their planning. I don't know if that has commenced or not. You were saying that there are always surprises around. We don't know what's going to happen next year, so can we do any scenario planning? That is indeed an issue to be addressed. However, I would not argue that you should not do any scenario planning. You want to lay out different futures under trajectories that you can foresee. But there is surprise that comes in, that you cannot plan for, and that is not necessarily represented in the scenarios, which I would say needs to be accounted for in the sense that you try to make your strategies as robust as possible, as I was saying, in order to be able to cope with future shocks better, which means, for example, diversity is one of these strategies that I referred to. The other term that's quite often in the discussion is something called adaptive management. Whatever plans you make, keep them so open and flexible that you can at any time incorporate new information and these new trends. So don't plan single solutions that have a long commitment, but try to be diverse and flexible in a way. On the SDGs, yes, indeed, the Nexus deserves to be in there. We are working in a group of think tanks called Independent Research Forum to work out how a modular approach, we call it, could bring the Nexus concept into SDG development. We have a position paper on that that's explaining this, and I believe it's an important way forward because like all the other examples I gave, these goals must not stand alone and be ignorant of the other goals. They must be interlinked. It must be understood how they depend on each other and also how they can also have negative externalities if looked at one by one only. What else was there? The question whether climate change drives crisis or not, to my mind, is not a yes or no. We use the term threat multiplier. Any kind of resource squeeze, any climate change adds to already existing threats, or vice versa, makes a country more vulnerable to upcoming threats. So I wouldn't discard this question whether it contributes or not. I would just say if you can reduce that, I keep using the term resource squeeze, you may also improve securities, first of all food and water and energy security, and provide some contribution to stability. That's not enough, quite clearly. It's important there was a question about water coming from other countries. I think that is a very important aspect in the sense that it must be addressed. There's no easy solution to it, but I just came from Egypt where there's something that Tony Allen would call a sanctioned discourse. It's simply not discussed because it's not politically acceptable that Egypt depends on the water from another region, via the Nile in that case. But it must be addressed. I mean, it's easy for me to say. Afterwards, I'm going home and I'm looking at it from the distance. But if a country depends so strongly on external water or on external food or on external energy for that matter, you cannot close your eyes and say we don't discuss it, we just hope it works out. It must be aggressively, openly addressed, and even if that hurts. Equitable distribution of resources. are we looking at the right factors? Should we look at losses in developing countries, or should we focus on developed countries with a huge wastage? There's an increasing resource squeeze everywhere, in every country and in the world as a whole. So I am not in favor of pointing fingers at one particular region. I think it needs every single solution that works. If there's a decrease in wastage in developed countries, that's extremely important to address. If there's low resource use efficiency in production in developing countries, that's extremely important to address. Don't do it either or. And the same holds for, well, why focusing on supply side management rather than on demand side management? Don't say it has to be one or the other. You have to, under these growing pressures, you have to address any solution you can find, whether it's on the supply or on the demand side. Thanks.
Yes, I have a few remarks, and I hope I can also address some of the points raised. I would like to catch up, because I think you didn't go into this more, but I think the tools, what my colleague mentioned already, are very, very important instruments for informed decision making. If it's LEAP, WEEP from the Stockholm Environment Institute, well-established tools. If it's the tool, the web-based tool, what Rabi Mohtar was presenting, it's a bit like climate change modeling. I think we don't want to trust only one model. We want to actually see a variety of models developing scenarios, so we can actually base our decision making on a variety of models, which gives us even variety of avenues what a country could actually go into, or even a sub-region. But that's why I think these tools are important, and we have to look into ways how to actually fill them with adequate data for our region. That my concern is even the global studies on what were mentioned on the food losses globally. I think it was also IFPRI and CIVI who did a lot on this. I believe they're mainly so far based on other region information and data, not so much on our countries. And we have to work hard that we have better information, and that's why my call was for researchers to try to develop research projects to follow the value chains in your countries on particular products, maybe with partners in another Arab country, or maybe another sub-Mediterranean country, because, I mean, some of the products are rather similar, to see what can be done along the value chain. I mean, we are in the moment also working with partners in Tunisia in a different kind of nexus. Actually, it's a resource or waste efficiency, energy and water approach. But it might link actually to some of the issues what we also mentioned for Tunisia. That's the tools, how to optimize complex systems where you actually, in the primitive way, you have bananas, apples, and pears, but you still have for the society to decide if they want to have more bananas, apples, or pears. And you have to find a measure how you want to actually adjust it. I mean, you can only save climate change in your country. No, you won't be able to do it at a national level. But you can actually save on the water resources in one country. But at the same time, you can transfer energy, but it will not be efficient to transfer the water all over the country. So there are many factors which are important. Ali, you also mentioned the aspect of other factors contributing. I don't say the drought is not relevant, is the relevant factor for the Syrian situation or the crisis. But when you look at the global talk, a lot of people consider the Arab challenges in the moment primarily a 5-year social and 10-year economic problem. The aspect of how many water, energy resources will be left in 50 or 100 years are secondary. And I mean, my task is to voice concern that this is not enough. We have to look in the long term, and the SDGs will not stop in 5 and 10 years. We will look into much longer term, even longer term than currently the climate change debate is. What will be the future of Saudi Arabia without oil and water? What kind of alternatives can such a country have? For Syria in particular, I think, and that's very important, I mean, I've just this weekend been able to attend the water working groups. There are different sector working groups where Syrians under the ESCWA-led National Agenda for the Future of Syria, where Syrians for Syria are having a dialogue on the different futures in their sector. And it's interesting that the colleagues decide and discuss for water, for example, one of the proposals was looking into water-based national economy. Water conservation agriculture. So very clear priority areas. The UN, in particular ESCWA, will be one of the very few UN agencies who is actually now, this week, in Montreux and after in Geneva, to bring this initiative into the dialogue about the ongoing conflict parties. to bring this up, that there is a dialogue. Actually, I think ESCWA is the only UN organization who is addressing this. We are opening up for all the sectors with the other agencies also. So on the water already, UNICEF and others are involved. But I think the idea is here not that the UN is dealing with it, but the Syrian professionals in the different sectors are developing a future for their country. Question of water-rich Lebanon, it is always relative. I mean, when I look into my member countries, I have 17. When you look at the local situation in Gaza, I think Lebanon is relatively water-rich. And one has to, I mean, I don't want to promote, and I'm explicitly saying this, I'm not wanting to promote any trading of waters with any other countries. But we should not oversee that there are agreements developing between other countries, even impacting indirectly on the current status of potential for Lebanon to use its own potential water, its own water resources. We have seen on the 9th of December, under the assistance of the World Bank, after a lot of back and forth shuttling between high-level senior advisors, that your southern neighbor Israel and Jordan and Palestine agreed on a water swap, because it is for these three, it is more efficient to trade 50 million cubic meters in the south from Jordan to Israel, while in the north it is more easier for Jordan to actually get the additional 50 million cubic meters to Amman from the Lake Tiberias, from Israel. And there is also, well, this is one aspect you address, and you are very rightly addressing it. I believe it would have been wise to have a wider basin dialogue, and I'm still looking forward that this might actually take place. I was very surprised that the World Bank can go ahead with this without all 5 riparians. I heard the word groundwater somewhere, and that always comes from my heart. So I wanted to say something on that. I mean, for those who would like to know a little bit more about what we actually know, we don't know so much about the actual extent of transboundary groundwaters. Groundwaters, yes, there is of course a major project of UNDP, and hopefully actually it will lead to a better knowledge of the whole groundwater situation in the country. And there are many other aspects. But I think so far we didn't really know so much how much water is in the subsurface moving also from Lebanon to the 2 neighboring countries. There is more information needed, and I believe there is already, I mean, what we tried with what I presented in my advertising, and the advertising clip in between, there is this inventory on transboundary, or actually shared water resources in the Arab region, or West Asia. There are some chapters which also deal with groundwater. I mean, there is groundwater connected to rivers, but there is also groundwater, for example, in the anti-Lebanon mountains, which have been only marginally studied so far. And it's interesting to look into this a bit more. What can the future Syria and Lebanon have as potential benefits in jointly developing and using it? And I think I just want to leave it at this. I think there is much more what we can do on research. I pointed out the food, the water. There are plenty of options, and I think it's up to Nadim now to fill the gap of the research.
It's true, we're building a lot of dams. We're spending a lot of money to build dams. But do we need these dams? Yes, we do. And we made the case in our strategy and in the surface storage plan that emanated from the strategy. Do we need to work on the demand side? Of course. It's very important, and this is why we talk about integrated approaches. This is what we did initially. The National Water Sector Strategy says it very frankly, and it's there. Now, in the implementation, maybe the media covers the inauguration of a dam or setting the stone for a dam more than it covers demand-side management. But because you know so much about dams, let me just say a few words on what we're doing on demand-side management. And I'll only talk about tariff because for me it's maybe the cornerstone, is the most essential part of demand-side management. You know that in Lebanon the tariff is still the flat tariff, so you pay once for whatever you use during the year. You pay a flat fee. Now this is where we're trying to move, and we started by some pilot projects. It's not easy. The transition is very hard. It includes a lot of factors, mainly economic and social, etc. So in some regions where technical conditions are available, we started implementing, putting meters, doing awareness sessions for people in these regions, installing saving devices in their houses. And this is all done through the Lebanese Center for Water Management and Conservation, who's, by the way, also leading the groundwater study. We're also training the utilities on how to use these meters, read them, and do the billing and collection, etc. So it's a lengthy process, but we're doing it. So the answer is yes, we are building dam, but at the same time, in parallel, we are very seriously working on demand-side management improvements.
Thank you.
Please.
The study that was conducted in the States, and they realized that the installation of the saving devices has resulted in a negative spillover, whereby people said, okay, I have the saving device, then now I can consume less water. So they started consuming more water implicitly, so just a comment that this could happen also here. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, just also one comment. When we talk about demand management, I think it's very important to consider the demand in the planning phase and come up with alternative strategies, which is not really happening. It's only happening post-planning phase, and it is just like taking some measures to decrease demand, where at the same time you are increasing supply a lot on the cost of the environment, which is actually just, I don't see like the balance in the favor of water conservation really, or the people's side really. So that's my comment.
Let me just one word on this. It is true, and this was also taken into account in our planning phase. Major part of the national water sector strategy is supply-demand forecasting. And it was made, we intentionally made it a long section, very transparent, all the drivers, enablers were detailed, and the demand graph and the demand line, we included all the demand-side management, all the demand reduction factors. So it's not only, and I agree with you, it's not something that we want to have afterwards, but it's also embedded in the planning exercise.
I just want to stress on something. You brought in the issue of bringing politics into the nexus approach. Well, the way I see it, if this approach is robust, in that it is scientifically and socially based on, all the integrations that you look at are based on science and socially acceptable and economically feasible. The politics, no matter how they change, will be brought in or will not be able to change what is being set in motion. Any policy, any strategy that is scientifically based, robust, integrative, and that is socially acceptable will stand to any political change that is occurring or any shift in politics. This is my belief. We will see when we start implementing the new water strategy, if the politics change in Lebanon, we'll see how that goes. But also when we get to sound national policies, if nationally our policies are sound, then transboundary relations and transboundary agreements are easier. Not necessarily easy, they become easier because you have something that you're basing on, that you bring to the table. There are no gaps in it. It's sound, it's solid, and you can talk from that point. And the whole process, the nexus approach, Ralf pointed it out well, in that It is a dynamic process that is continuously being revised, that's continuously being looked at and changed. If anything is static, it's passé. It loses its use. So if we are quite dynamic in our approach, then we are able to produce policies and strategies that are well integrated, because today this is an issue that we're looking at. Tomorrow this might not be the issue that we're addressing. It might be something that is input with others. So it has to be dynamic. It has to be also iterative, because it moves from one iteration to the other, because if there are improvements, then they have to build on those improvements and not stay static and building on what was achieved. And just one point, trading water. It is already happening. We are selling Sahha, Sannin, all that. But if we're talking about bulk, if putting it in containers and selling it, that's another issue. But it's not that different. But the problem is, what we're working with, the data that we're working with is questionable. We don't know how much water we have. We really do not know how much water we have. So then that becomes another issue. We'll talk about that later. I'll talk about that later. I'll end here.
I'm practicing farming, and I need 1,000 cubic meters a year. I'm buying a cubic meter at $4. The offer to sell internationally by this initiative, if you know about Blue Gold, is $1 a cubic meter. I offered to buy it internally, and I have hundreds of farmers that are willing to pay this price, and they don't have access to water, or they have access to more expensive groundwater. But the whole issue, I mean, if the bottled water sector is a jungle, that doesn't mean that we have to make the rest of the water another jungle. I mean, this doesn't justify that. That's a discussion for a day, or at least.
Thank you all for attending, and thank you for our speakers and panelists. Please have